It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Jane Dreaper from the BBC. She's taken time out to come all the way up to Harrogate, especially for this session, and she's going to tell us a little bit about, well, science versus the media when two worlds collide. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks very much, and lovely for me to be here today, having previously reported from Harrogate Conference Centre on various doctors and nurses union conferences, so it's nice to come here and meet you all. Bit of background about myself. I'm Jane Draper, BBC health correspondent. I've been with the BBC over 21 years, been a journalist more years than I care to remember now, having had a career before I joined the BBC with local newspapers in the north and also with local commercial radio. And I should just explain, actually, I'm off air at the moment. I'm doing a one-year attachment with a completely different part of the BBC. After 12 years as a health correspondent, I just needed a bit of a change, so I'm learning about some other sides of broadcasting as a business, and I'm up in Glasgow at the moment doing quite a bit of work about a new TV channel that's going to launch there in a year's time. So if you haven't heard or seen me lately, this is still the substantive job, and I'll be back in it next September, but that's what I'm up to at the moment. I'll just sort of talk you through a bit about the health team, what we do. I love Giles's arguments for engagement and also about some of the variations in editorial control. And I'm basically the person who will come along with a microphone and hopefully not shove it in your face in too confrontational a way. I think that science versus the media is a little bit of a confrontational, deliberately provocative title, but it's to try and get forward the idea that, you know, your world is quite different to mine, and hopefully by explaining a bit about what we do, and I'll take you through a couple of examples that just show how journalists and researchers can work together. And one of my examples is a proactive one, so it was an original story where I spent quite a lot of time working with that researcher, building up the relationship. The other one was a much more classic, the day before an embargo lifts, we kind of get on and decide we're going to do something with it and turn it around quite quickly, and we do an awful lot of that within our team. So the BBC Health team, of which I am part, we have a number of correspondents, including an editor, Hugh Pym. Hugh's title, people get quite confused by the editor title. He doesn't sit there and kind of overall dictate what a programme does. He doesn't boss around the rest of us, but he's the senior correspondent. He takes an editorial lead over what we do as a team, particularly on the policy stories. We also have a medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh, very excellent, long-standing correspondent. Fergus doesn't do the NHS policy stories, which the rest of us cover as a very important part of the brief. And we have a correspondent in Salford, Dominic Hughes. Dom is very much one of our team, but he tells his stories from Salford, and he's just as likely to do a research paper in the BMJ as the rest of us. But the whole point of having Salford is to increase that northern voice, that northern focus. And clearly, if a hospital in, say, Morecambe Bay is having some issues, he'll be the person who will go and cover that. We have a couple of really excellent producers, and it's kind of hard from the outside to understand what producers do, but I would describe them as the sort of fuel that runs the car, basically. They sift through the huge volume of stories that we get each day. They work out what our priorities should be in the team, what we are probably going to discard, the sort of fluffier lifestyle stories, the attitudinal surveys aside of the proper research. And they might well go out and film stories and get what we call clips, sound bites that you will see in pieces. And they work out who's doing what and try and keep on top of our disparate, busy team. We have an assignment editor. She is a very busy woman because she looks after not only health but also the science and environment teams. So that's a lot of different people to juggle, a lot of different stories. And she is probably more internal facing, so she goes to a lot of the BBC senior editorial meetings, represents our stories, and untangles any issues that we might have internally, and she's kind of an advocate for our pieces. And we have website reporters, although increasingly these days we are all TV, radio, online. My background really, because I came into the BBC through radio, is very much radio facing, but these days, particularly if you're doing an original story, you do it for everyone, and our website reporters broadcast brilliantly. Michelle Roberts being one name that you may know, originally the website, but she does a lot of radio, TV as well, and she's actually a trained doctor, which makes her a great asset in our team. And we have a range of customers. I work for something called News Gathering. We literally gather the news within the BBC. So we work with one particular story and we provide it to our customers. So on TV, that's anything from breakfast on BBC One in the morning. The 1, 6 and 10 o'clock news bulletins are clearly big priorities for us. The channel, as we call what used to be News 24, the news channel, continuous news, so they'll often want a correspondent on set in the studio if something is breaking. The whole range of radio stations, people often introduce me at parties as, oh, it's Jane from Today. Well, actually, it's 5 Live, it's Radio 2 Jeremy Vine show, have a fantastic audience, never turn down the chance to do Jeremy Vine if they come calling. The website, obviously, is significant. Global outlets, World Service Radio is now paid for by the licence fee, so they are an important customer. World TV are funded separately, but we still do an awful lot for them. They have a huge appetite for science and medical stories. Digital video is another big area for us. So we have a Facebook page, BBC News Health and Lifestyle page, and also we are increasingly trying to do the sort of shorter films that you see on your phone, because those are very different to your classic TV film and they involve captions and a lot of forethought and often a different sort of format. So there's a lot going on there. And we have huge demand, which is great. People love health stories, which is really good news. You know, we're never not busy, and even quite sort of what we might think of in the team as quite middle-ranking stories can actually take on a real momentum and go through the day across a number of different programmes. So that's good, but it keeps us busy. Just one quick example, the Friday before last, the Radio 4 8 o'clock bulletin had 3 big health stories in it. So there was the National Audit Office report about the NHS cyber attack, how it happened and what had gone wrong. A report by the CQC, Care Quality Commission, into children's mental health, the terrible waiting lists and the terrible burdens and outcomes as a result. And a really interesting journal paper, okay, it was only one hospital in France, but about the timing of heart surgery, and does doing it later in the day help people with their body clocks? And that got a lot of traction as well. So that wasn't an everyday day, but that was they happen very often, sort of 3 big stories in that key 8 o'clock bulletin, and that sort of shows the sort of output we are producing. So I talk about a typical day. There's not really a typical day, but it's very common for us to have as many as 15 possible health stories. And sometimes when I've done these talks, I've come with a sort of sheaf of papers that the producers are kind of wading through on any given day. And they have to know, even if we're not doing stories, they have to show that they've looked at it and why we're not doing it, because programmes will still say, we think it's really interesting, we want to fill that slot. And we're trying to say it's not good research, we don't think it's been done well, we don't think you should focus on that. That number can sometimes push up as many as 30. Many of them will be research related. Only 2 or 3 will make the grade. The website might get through sort of more like 4 or 5 stories in a day on the BBC News Health page, because obviously the web, you know, you don't have limited slots. You could keep going and put up a lot of stuff. But for broadcast, you've got limited airtime. We're competing in a way with other different bits of the BBC. So there are plenty of stories. If you're ever thinking you've done a really interesting paper and why is nobody interested, there are plenty of perfectly valid stories that just don't get on air because it is a very crowded agenda. And I guess the main takeaway would be this slide. If I only want you to sort of take one thing from my talk, it's about that our timelines are very tight. So what Giles was describing earlier about that focus in narrowing down the clip and getting to the point where the researcher or the scientist can really boil down in clear terms what they're saying. I'm sometimes doing that with huge urgency, but it really is worth engaging with. And it's also to say that if a journalist contacts you, don't sort of think, oh, I'll get back in a few hours because we don't have time to hang around. We'll have gone to somebody else by then probably. So do engage very quickly, because we're working at quite a fast pace. Embargoes help us, but increasingly we're just turning stuff around as quickly as we can. So I'm going to play you an example where, unlike all of that huge sense of urgency, I did have some time to build up a relationship with a researcher about something that an editor had indicated he was very interested in, and it resulted in this piece on the 6 o'clock news about a problem that is quite sort of seemingly intractable to solve. How do you push up breastfeeding rates in deprived areas? And just to give you a quick run through, because you won't see what we call the Astons, these are like the subtitles that come up when someone's speaking, so you know who they are. So the first person who speaks is quite clearly a mother with her baby. Then you see Claire Relton, the researcher from the University of Sheffield, who I worked with closely on this. And then you see Dr. Colin Michie from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. So you'll see them in that order, and I'll just play this piece to you.
Now, should mothers be offered financial incentives to breastfeed their babies? The BBC has seen results from the first stage of a trial giving shopping vouchers to mothers in areas where breastfeeding rates are low. The scheme in South Yorkshire and Derbyshire follows similar projects on smoking and obesity. It was successful, so much so that researchers say they're about to expand it dramatically. Our health correspondent Jane Draper has this exclusive report.
Baby James is 8 months old, and his mum says they have a special bond. Vanessa Purdy is among a group of women offered shopping vouchers worth up to £200 in return for breastfeeding. The research project gave her the confidence to continue with something which can prove testing for new mums.
The vouchers basically something that lures you into the scheme and into breastfeeding, but the confidence and the amount of friends that you make through this scheme is unbelievable, and it's that spurs you on to continue, not the money. It's just having a support network that previously I never found.
This is an early stage in what will be a much bigger trial. Breastfeeding rates where the research is taking place are usually low, between 21 and 29%. Just over 100 women were invited to take part. 34% claimed vouchers for breastfeeding their babies at 6 to 8 weeks.
So this is the claim form that eligible mums will be getting?
The researchers believe the potential gains from breastfeeding make financial rewards worthwhile. A mother's milk helps protect babies from infection, but women on lower incomes are less likely to breastfeed.
We know that the UK has one of the worst breastfeeding rates in the world, and we know that babies that are breastfed and mums that breastfeed have better health outcomes than those who don't. We also know that babies and mums who breastfeed actually cost the NHS less.
The shopping vouchers scheme has focused on areas here in Sheffield and Derbyshire where breastfeeding isn't popular. The researchers believe their early results show the idea can work on a much bigger scale, but offering incentives worth £200 has proved controversial.
There are a number of mums who start all right and start to feed well, but of course things don't always work out well between them and the baby, and sometimes breastfeeding doesn't last very long, so that this incentivization scheme really makes them feel kind of bad about the whole business. I'm sure it does, and gives the whole business of feeding your baby a rather negative set of connotations.
The vouchers helped Vanessa Purdy feel valued as a new mother, but some critics say the scheme amounts to bribery. As the research goes into the next stage involving 4,000 families, the arguments about it will continue. Jane Draper, BBC News, Sheffield. And I think you'll agree the real star of the show there was baby James and his mum. The logistics of that were, we did a day's filming in Sheffield. It was actually pouring with rain more than it shows when we got around to doing the piece to camera. And of course everything had to revolve around the baby. And you know, if you ring up somebody a week ahead of time to have a nice chat, and you have a nice chat, you say, how would you feel about breastfeeding your baby on camera? People don't kind of go, oh yeah, I'd love to be on telly doing that. Vanessa felt, you know, understandably wary about that. I didn't know whether she would feel comfortable until we were actually in her home, and she talked brilliantly on the phone, which said, I'm really nervous about doing this. She was absolutely fine. I knew she'd be fine because she did, once she'd said she was nervous and told me all about that, she actually talked about it so clearly and so well, and was so happy in communicating what she'd got from this. Now, I mean, you'll notice from the figures there, it was a very small improvement, and we did have some debate internally about those figures and whether it was meaningful enough to show. But I think what won this story through was the fact that it looked at this interesting and controversial area of incentivisation. clip with Claire, the researcher, actually took a long time. We probably did about 20, maybe 25 minutes on tape to get that. I think it's about probably 12 seconds in there, the why, why it's important to do this research from Giles's useful framing of the questions to think about. And it is, I appreciate it's very difficult when you've worked on something for years to boil it down to sort of 10, 12 seconds, and people almost feel understandably a little bit insulted by it. But, that's a story that then reached millions of people that evening and got follow-up. So it really is worth it from the impact. And it was important to me to have Colin Mickey's viewpoint in there as well to represent the women who find breastfeeding hard and, don't engage with it so easily, and to have somebody saying that. I'll just take you through to something completely different now. This is the story that we just turned around the day before, and this actually related to an 8-page paper in the BMJ, and part of being a specialist journalist is actually going to the paper and reading it. I mean, we might skim a press release to see, does this look like something we want to know more about? But as the reporter, we will always go and actually read the actual paper and look at the figures carefully, look at the charts, and that is an important part of having a specialist team. So this was raising a question about whether there was a link between men losing their hair and heart disease, and we thought this was possibly an interesting story to look at. There's the blurb from the BMJ Open, the actual sort of summary. So it's a meta-analysis, they're observational studies. It's very much a possibility of a link, obviously not causation, and they say this is worth thinking about. So this is how I told the story on Today with one of our best known presenters, and this was quite early in the morning, first bite at the story.
Minutes past 6 now. Worried about losing your hair? Well, maybe you should be, and not out of vanity. Our health correspondent is Jane Draper. And Jane, this is about research that the British Heart Foundation research that says there is a link between baldness and heart disease.
That's right. It's actually not been done by the British Heart Foundation, although they've got something to say about it. This has been done by some Japanese researchers, and it's published in the journal BMJ Open. They looked at 6 studies involving 37,000 participants from America and Europe.
Not just men, by the way, is it?
This is men.
That is only men,
yes,
right? Yep.
That's right, because obviously hair thinning is something that particularly affects men as they get older, and it's very common. What they found was that men who've lost most of their hair from the top of the head are up to a third more likely to develop heart disease than men who still have their hair. Although, interestingly, they found that a receding hairline at the front doesn't give any sort of increased risk. But it is a link. This isn't saying that baldness goes on to cause problems with your heart. It's just saying that if your hair is thinning, maybe you should have an extra think about the health of your heart and the way you live your life.
Well, I tell you, there's 5 men in the studio at the moment, and when you were saying that, every one of them was touching the crown of his head, just looking slightly worried. So how seriously should we take this?
Well, the British Heart Foundation is keen to say that men shouldn't be alarmed. I mean, obviously, having your hair thin is very closely connected with identity and can cause people varying amounts of distress. But overall, it's always important in this sort of work to remember your overall risk, which is still likely to be quite small, of getting heart disease if you look after yourself. So the British Heart Foundation says it comes back down to the usual messages, things like stopping smoking, keeping to a healthy weight, watching your blood pressure and cholesterol levels.
Right, and buying a wig won't help.
Probably not, but it might make you feel better.
In that case, it might help. Jane, thanks a lot.
So that was me doing that on the ISDN line from home. There's probably one of the world's worst selfies. An ISDN line is like a high-quality phone line, and it enables me to do little bits of broadcasting at that hideous hour of the day, but it's an absolutely key hour of the day. The first hour of our breakfast radio shows, Radio 4, 5 Live, sort of sets up the listeners for the day. So what we call those early two-ways are a very important part of what we do in the team, and part of the 24/7 service that we give. And what I'm trying to do there is trot through things like association versus cause, relative versus absolute risk without using those terms. So the Today audience, of course, is really sophisticated, but ultimately it's a general audience, and we don't want to blind them with terms. We are trying to just boil stuff down, tell it in an everyday way. And that story we actually did for breakfast TV and for the 1 o'clock news as well. We got some VOUCHERS of balding men who were unlucky enough to be near Oxford Circus on that day. Tony, the cameraman, described it as a low point in his career. I'm not sure he was entirely joking. And I did a piece to camera for the television 1 o'clock news from the clinic where Wayne Rooney happened to have his hair transplant. But we didn't sort of, we one of these instances where we ring somewhere and say, we're coming in, can we come in? Absolutely nothing in it for you, but could we come and film at your facility? And they kindly let us in. So that's just to illustrate some of what we do. And Twitter is a really important thing for me. This is, if you're keen on Twitter, you'll recognise it's a very old sort of typeface, and this was from a while ago. But for me, talking about the stories that I've got coming up, even under embargo, which you can do if you don't give the game away completely, you get people like Roy Lilly, who's quite a well-known healthcare commentator, pitching in, and people wanted to engage on the whole baldness thing. I've been tweeting since 2009, and personally I regard it as a really important communication tool. You do get grief on there sometimes, but it's a good way, I think, of reaching particularly doctors and nurses who I wouldn't otherwise get through usual channels. Just a quick upsum, because I want to leave time for some questions. The ideal research story for us in the BBC Health team, we like things that are in peer-reviewed publications. We don't have a blanket rule of, we don't have any rule about that we won't do conference abstracts or whatever, but peer-reviewed publication is the sort of gold standard for us. We want something that gives a strong, clear message and is accessible for a general audience and tells us something new or surprising. So, if we feel a story is more of the same, it's less likely to get on air. And as you've seen from the piece I showed you from the 6 o'clock news, if we can have a case study who's available for a broadcast interview, that clearly takes a lot of time and setting up and trust and engagement, but it really helps a story sing. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Jane. That was a really useful insight into the inner workings of the BBC, I think. We've got time for a few questions. Again, if you'd like to step up to the microphone, that would be really helpful.
Jane, thank you very much. Very nice to see you in person after having heard you over many years. You say that you have peer-reviewed publications which you pick up. Where does the mechanism of a press release lie? So if a group of people decided that they felt there was enough scientific evidence to put forward adding spinach to a particular diet, would that be something which you could take up, or something slightly more scientific than spinach possibly? Would they issue a press release, and where does that come from, and who does it go to, and how would they do that? And do you have a list of press releases which are coming at you all the time?
Yes, we have sort of various email lists, and the journals contact us. I mean, I suppose with something like that, if you've got a group of interested scientists, people might just literally ring the BBC, get through to the health team. We would talk to them and say, have you got a sort of written summary of what you're arguing? But I think, if it was people doing something off their own bat, we'd want to look at it quite closely and assess, well, what is the evidence? How does it stack up? It might make a story, it might make a sort of longer term feature perhaps. It's something we'd consider, but we take a pretty close look at what is the basis for somebody saying this, as you would expect from a team of specialists. We do scrutinise stuff pretty closely. If, for example, politicians from any party come to us with a freedom of information request story, we sort of say, well, can we look at the raw data? Can we look at the spreadsheets? We want to go back through everything, because you'd be amazed, well, you probably wouldn't be amazed, but it's often that things don't quite stack up, and we like to crawl all over it as much as we can. I hope that helps.
Jane, I might ask a quick question if I may. So when you're producing a story off the back of, say, a paper that's been published or is about to be published in the BMJ or wherever, do you always go and contact the researchers? And if so, what are the types of questions that you're asking from them?
Yeah, we nearly always contact the researcher. I mean, sometimes it might just be a quick email, and it might be that one of the website people, they often sort of get started a bit sooner than us, so they might fire off a few initial questions. But nearly always after you've read the paper, you want to sort of have a bit of engagement, even if a lot of the answers are in there. Some of the paper might sort of lead you with further questions, and you just want to know their availability as well. And if you have a chat with them on the phone, which we often do, you want to know, are they actually going to be somebody that we could suggest to programs that they put in front of the camera? We want to hear how they communicate. So we're often following up for detail, but sort of sussing out them as a potential interviewee, and again, you know, that's part of what we want to do. I should have said the baldness study, the Japanese researchers, partly because of the time zone, I think we got a few answers by email, possibly overnight. We didn't even have a chance to assess how well they spoke English, and you know, all of that of course is key and part of, again, the work that we do.
Brilliant. Tony.
Hi Jane, just one question about the relationship with, say, the press office of an institution or a hospital. I mean, I've been aware of some people who have perhaps fallen out of being able to speak to people because they said, I just need to check with my press office, and that's 2 or 3 hours later, and by the time they get back, they've missed it. Do we need to get better relations with our press offices and our press departments in hospitals and institutions so they can be as reactive as they need to be?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Often when research does come out, the individual doctor or scientist usually feels free enough to speak themselves, which is tremendously helpful, because it's not to denigrate the work of press officers at all. You know, we couldn't just march into a hospital and go filming there, for example. We always would go through the press office and just do that, because we know it's not only the right way, it's the quickest way to get the job done that we need to do. It is really tricky if it loses you time, and occasionally journals will say go through the press officer, and then you are in the hands of that press officer. So yes, I think from your point of view, if you have good relations with them, and you know, we often email people directly, because we've found over the years that with doctors, scientists, researchers, an email is the quickest way to get a response, and they might not, you know, a landline is the worst. It seems to ring in some dusty office that where nobody's opened the door for about 10 years. You try it, but you don't usually get them that way. So it's a press office, when it works well, can really speed up the wheels of a story. But yes, I think we've all had experiences where it gets bogged down. It's very frustrating all round to miss that opportunity. I mean, the other thing is that the journals, I'm sure this happens from your point of view too, seem pretty bad about actually telling people when something is going to publish. And it's very typical that a paper comes out and somebody's out of the country on holiday in Australia, they're dying to do it, we're dying to get them, and it's just not possible. And that can be a source of frustration. So if anyone can sort out that problem, that would be great.
Okay, I think it's probably the last question for this bit of the session.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Shoaib from Saudi Arabia. Actually, I have a few quick questions. One is, you know, there is nowadays, it's very common to receive messages on Twitter or emails as regards my relatives and my friends who are asking me questions about diet, about cancer, the chemotherapies, and there are many myths rather than realities. And so how your like BBC and how they are working on diffusing these myths and clearing up the realities. Because I feel, and the other question is as regards the clinicians, is there any way we can suggest you some topics, or we can participate in in your work for the education of the masses? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, obviously our brief at the BBC is inform, educate, entertain. Having said that, we need to sort of have a reason for doing a story, and particularly in terms of scientific research, publication in a paper is one very common one, but that doesn't mean obviously that we're not going out and researching our own. I think what you say about myth busting is really important, and particularly on social media, it's another reason for all of us engaging with it. And an important part of what we do in a specialist team, and that can work internally as well when we're advising our programs about how to construct things. And I think, you know, probably the biggest example of all of that is the MMR vaccine debate, and I think everybody learnt a lot from the way that was sort of handled originally 10, 15 years ago, and the importance of listening to good science and good scientific advice, and the fact that, you know, there are certain areas where it's not productive to have a 50-50 debate because that doesn't reflect the science. I think it's something that's probably a mission, part of our mission for all of us as specialists. Hope that helps.
Great, thank you very much, Jane. So I think, thank you very much for that talk.